The autumn wind swept across the cemetery grounds that October night, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Security lights cast long shadows between weathered headstones, creating an ethereal landscape where silence reigned supreme, except for the gentle rustling of oak branches overhead. It was in this peaceful sanctuary of memory that Garrett Thornfield had found his calling as a night watchman, walking the quiet paths between rows of granite markers, ensuring the eternal rest of those who lay beneath remained undisturbed. For 3 years, Garrett had been the guardian of Willowbrook Cemetery, a sprawling 40-acre memorial ground that had served the community since the late 1800s. His colleagues at the security company often wondered how he could spend entire nights alone among the graves. But Garrett found solace in the stillness. There was something profoundly peaceful about the responsibility of watching over those who could no longer watch over themselves. On that particular evening of October 14th, 1979, everything appeared routine. The day shift supervisor, Marcus Harding, had completed his final rounds before departing at 8 in the evening, leaving detailed notes in the logbook as always. The cemetery grounds were secure, the maintenance equipment properly stored, and the wrought iron gates locked according to protocol. As darkness settled over Columbus, Garrett arrived for what would become the most mysterious night in Willowbrook Cemetery's long history. Garrett was a man of simple pleasures and steady habits. At 42 years old, he had spent most of his adult life working night shifts, first at a textile factory and later in private security. His wife Eleanor often remarked that he seemed more alive during the dark hours, moving with a quiet confidence that daylight never quite brought out in him. Their marriage of 16 years had weathered various storms, but Eleanor had grown accustomed to sleeping alone, while her husband kept vigil over the city's sleeping and eternal residents. The watchman's routine was methodical and comforting in its predictability. Upon arrival, he would first check the small guardhouse situated near the main entrance, a modest structure equipped with a desk, chair, telephone, and a small electric heater for cold nights. His thermos of coffee, prepared by Eleanor, would be placed beside the logbook where he meticulously recorded his observations throughout each shift. Every hour on the hour, Garrett would walk a predetermined route through the cemetery grounds, checking for signs of vandalism, unauthorized visitors, or any disturbances that might threaten the sacred peace of the place. What made Garrett particularly suited for this role was his genuine respect for the deceased and their families. Unlike some security guards who viewed cemeteries as merely another property to patrol, he understood that each grave represented a life lived, a story concluded, and loved ones left behind to mourn. He had witnessed countless funeral services during his tenure, observing from a respectful distance as families said their final goodbyes. These experiences had deepened his sense of purpose and reinforced his commitment to protecting this hallowed ground. The Willowbrook Cemetery itself held a unique place in the community's heart. Established in 1883, it had grown from a small family burial ground into one of the region's most beautiful memorial parks. Ancient elm and oak trees provided natural canopies over winding gravel paths, while carefully maintained flower beds added touches of color throughout the changing seasons. The cemetery was divided into several sections, each with its own character and history. The older section near the entrance featured elaborate Victorian monuments and family mausoleums, their ornate stonework telling stories of prominent families and successful merchants from the area's industrial past. More recent sections of the cemetery reflected changing times and sensibilities, with simpler headstones and memorial plaques arranged in orderly rows. A small chapel stood at the cemetery's heart, its stained glass windows catching morning sunlight during funeral services. Behind the chapel, a maintenance building housed groundskeeping equipment, tools, and supplies necessary for the ongoing care of the property. It was this building that would later become central to understanding the events of that October night. During the weeks leading up to his disappearance, Garrett had mentioned to Eleanor that he had noticed some unusual activities around the cemetery. Nothing dramatically suspicious, he assured her, but small inconsistencies that caught his experienced eye. Tools that weren't returned to their proper places in the maintenance shed. Tire tracks near the rear gate that didn't match any of the cemetery's vehicles. Fresh cigarette butts in areas where visitors rarely ventured. These observations troubled him enough that he had begun paying extra attention to the more remote sections of the cemetery during his nightly rounds. Eleanor would later tell investigators that her husband had seemed slightly more preoccupied than usual in the days before October 14th. Not worried exactly, but more thoughtful, as if he were trying to piece together a puzzle that remained just beyond his understanding. She remembered him mentioning that some of the groundskeeping supplies had been going missing, small amounts that might not be noticed immediately, but enough to suggest someone was taking materials without authorization. The cemetery's management had indeed received reports from the head groundskeeper Theodore Walsh about missing supplies and equipment. Bags of fertilizer, small hand tools, even some of the bronze polish used to maintain memorial plaques had been disappearing gradually over several weeks. Walsh had initially attributed these shortages to poor inventory management or occasional borrowing by staff members who forgot to log their usage. However, as the pattern continued, it became clear that someone was systematically removing materials from the premises. What made these thefts particularly puzzling was their seemingly random nature. Rather than targeting expensive equipment or tools with obvious resale value, the perpetrator appeared to be taking mundane supplies that would be difficult to sell and easy to purchase legitimately. This suggested either someone with very specific needs, or perhaps someone who simply had convenient access to the cemetery grounds and was taking advantage of that access for petty theft. Garrett had shared his observations with Marcus Harding during their brief overlap on October 14th. The day shift supervisor later recalled their conversation as routine, but noted that Garrett had asked specific questions about recent deliveries to the maintenance building and whether any staff members had been working unusual hours. Nothing in their discussion suggested that Garrett anticipated any immediate danger, but his questions indicated he was actively trying to understand the pattern of missing supplies. As evening deepened on that October night, Garrett settled into his familiar routine. He made his first entry in the logbook at 9:15, noting clear skies, temperature around 50 degrees, and no unusual observations. His handwriting was steady and clear, showing no signs of distress or concern. The entry mentioned that he planned to pay particular attention to the maintenance area during his rounds, following up on the inventory discrepancies that had been discussed earlier. The cemetery at night possessed a unique atmosphere that visitors during daylight hours could never fully appreciate. Without the sounds of traffic or daily activity, the space took on an almost timeless quality. Garrett often remarked to Eleanor that walking among the graves after midnight felt like moving through history itself, surrounded by the stories of generations who had called this area home. The ornate Victorian monuments seemed to whisper tales of loves lost and fortunes made, while the simpler modern markers spoke of ordinary lives lived with quiet dignity. On this particular evening, a light mist had begun to form as temperatures dropped, creating an ethereal quality to the security lighting scattered throughout the grounds. The mist wasn't thick enough to impair visibility significantly, but it added a dreamlike quality to familiar landmarks. Garrett's flashlight beam cut through the gentle haze as he made his first scheduled round at 10 o'clock, following the worn path that connected the cemetery's various sections. His route typically began at the main entrance, proceeded through the historic section with its elaborate monuments, continued past the chapel to the maintenance building, then curved through the newer sections before returning to the guardhouse. The entire circuit took approximately 30 minutes at Garrett's measured pace, allowing him time to observe carefully and investigate anything that seemed out of place. On quiet nights, these walks provided time for reflection and a sense of connection to the community he served. The 10 o'clock round proceeded without incident. Garrett's logbook entry, made upon his return to the guardhouse, noted that all gates remained secure, no unauthorized vehicles were present, and the maintenance building appeared undisturbed. However, he did mention noticing fresh tire tracks near the rear service gate, though he couldn't determine when they had been made or whether they were connected to legitimate cemetery business. For those of us trying to understand what happened next, it's important to realize that Garrett was not a man given to flights of imagination or unnecessary worry. His 3 years of experience had taught him to distinguish between genuinely concerning observations and the normal sounds and shadows that characterize any large outdoor space at night. When he noted something in his logbook, it was because his trained eye had detected a real deviation from normal conditions. At 11 o'clock, Garrett departed for his second scheduled round. This would be the last entry he would make in the logbook and the final confirmed sighting of him alive. According to the investigative timeline later established by authorities, something occurred during this round that would forever change the lives of everyone connected to Willowbrook Cemetery and leave a mystery that continues to puzzle those who remember the case. The events that followed can only be reconstructed from physical evidence and the discoveries made the following morning. What investigators found painted a picture of a night that began routinely but ended in circumstances that defied easy explanation. The quiet cemetery that had provided Garrett with 3 years of peaceful employment became the setting for his unexplained disappearance, leaving behind more questions than answers and a community struggling to understand how a dedicated watchman could simply vanish during what should have been an ordinary shift. When dawn broke over Willowbrook Cemetery on October 15th, the first sign that something was terribly wrong came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman, an elderly widow who visited her husband's grave every morning at precisely 7:30, noticed that the guardhouse light was still on and the door stood slightly ajar. In her 3 years of maintaining this daily ritual, she had never seen the building left unsecured after the night shift ended. Eleanor Thornfield had already begun to worry. Garrett's shift officially ended at 6 in the morning, and he typically arrived home by 6:20, tired but punctual as always. When 7 o'clock passed without his familiar footsteps on their front porch, she called the cemetery office. The phone rang unanswered, which wasn't unusual since the administrative staff didn't arrive until 8:30, but Eleanor's maternal instincts told her something was fundamentally wrong. Marcus Harding received the first official notification at 7:45 when Mrs. Kellerman approached him as he arrived for his morning shift. Walking quickly to the guardhouse, Marcus found a scene that would be burned into his memory forever. Garrett's thermos sat half empty beside the logbook, still warm to the touch. His jacket hung on the back of the chair exactly where he always placed it during his rounds. The electric heater hummed quietly, suggesting Garrett had intended to return. Most unsettling of all, the logbook showed his final entry at 11 o'clock the previous evening, marking the beginning of what should have been a routine patrol. The Columbus Police Department's initial response reflected the uncertainty surrounding Garrett's disappearance. Detective Raymond Cole, a 20-year veteran of the force, arrived at the cemetery shortly after Marcus's emergency call. Cole had investigated missing persons cases before, but rarely one where the circumstances seemed so deliberately preserved, as if time had stopped in the middle of an ordinary moment. Eleanor arrived at the cemetery within minutes of receiving Marcus's call. Her face pale but determined, she examined her husband's belongings with the intimate knowledge that only a spouse of 16 years could possess. Nothing appeared to be missing or out of place. His wallet remained in his jacket pocket, containing $37 and his identification. His wristwatch, a retirement gift from the textile factory, sat beside the thermos exactly where he always placed it during his rounds. Even his wedding ring rested on the desk, a habit Eleanor knew he maintained to prevent losing it while walking the cemetery grounds at night. Detective Cole's methodical approach to the investigation began with a systematic search of the cemetery grounds. What they discovered near the maintenance building would transform this missing person case into something far more mysterious and troubling. Approximately 50 yards behind the building, Cole's team found a series of footprints in the soft earth that appeared to match Garrett's work boots. The prints showed his normal walking gait for roughly 20 feet before suddenly becoming deeper and more erratic, suggesting either a struggle or sudden movement. More disturbing still was where the footprints ended. At the base of the cemetery's rear wall, the track simply stopped, as if Garrett had vanished into the air itself. The wall stood 8 feet high, topped with decorative ironwork that would make climbing difficult for a man of Garrett's age and build. No scuff marks on the stone suggested he had attempted to scale it, and no footprints appeared on the opposite side, where investigators gained access through the neighboring property. The ground around this area told a story that investigators struggled to interpret. Disturbed soil and scattered leaves suggested some kind of altercation had occurred, but the physical evidence remained frustratingly incomplete. A thorough examination of the maintenance building revealed that several items were indeed missing, confirming the inventory discrepancies that had concerned Garrett during his final weeks. However, the missing materials seemed even more random and worthless than previously believed, including basic maintenance supplies that would have minimal value to any potential thief. As news of Garrett's disappearance spread through the community, the investigation took on an increasingly urgent tone. Eleanor's quiet dignity in the face of uncertainty touched everyone who met her, while local media coverage brought volunteers from throughout the region to assist in search efforts. The image of a dedicated night watchman simply vanishing while protecting a sacred space resonated deeply with residents who had never previously given much thought to cemetery security. Detective Cole's team expanded their investigation beyond the cemetery grounds, interviewing neighbors, examining financial records, and pursuing every lead that emerged from the growing publicity surrounding the case. What they discovered was a portrait of a man whose life contained no obvious sources of conflict or danger. Garrett's financial situation was stable, his marriage appeared solid, and his employment record showed consistent reliability and professionalism. However, as investigators dug deeper into the pattern of missing supplies from the cemetery, a more complex picture began to emerge. Theodore Walsh, the head groundskeeper, provided detailed inventories that revealed the thefts had been occurring for nearly 6 months, well before Garrett had begun to notice them. The methodical nature of these thefts suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the cemetery's operations and access to the maintenance building. This revelation led investigators to examine the backgrounds of all cemetery employees, a process that created tension and suspicion among staff members who had previously worked together harmoniously. The investigation revealed that 2 part-time groundskeepers had been selling surplus materials to supplement their modest incomes, but their activities appeared to be separate from and unrelated to Garrett's disappearance. As October turned to November, the investigation began to reveal its first major limitation: the lack of witnesses or surveillance in the area. The cemetery's remote location and the late hour of Garrett's disappearance meant that potential witnesses were virtually non-existent. Detective Cole's team canvassed the surrounding neighborhood multiple times, but found no residents who reported seeing or hearing anything unusual during the night in question. The case took an unexpected turn when investigators discovered that someone had been using the cemetery grounds for unauthorized meetings during evening hours. Fresh tire tracks, cigarette butts, and other evidence suggested that the remote location had been serving as a meeting place for individuals involved in activities they preferred to keep private. While these discoveries raised hopes that witnesses might emerge, the clandestine nature of these gatherings meant that potential witnesses were reluctant to come forward. Winter's arrival brought both new challenges and growing frustration for everyone involved in the search for answers. Snow covered the cemetery grounds, potentially obscuring evidence that might have been missed during initial searches. Eleanor maintained her faith that Garrett would return, but the strain of uncertainty began to show in her increasingly fragile appearance and quiet demeanor. The investigation's most promising lead emerged in December when Detective Cole received an anonymous phone call from someone claiming to have information about activities at the cemetery. The caller described seeing vehicles near the rear gate on several occasions, but refused to provide contact information or meet with investigators. Despite Cole's best efforts, this mysterious informant never called again, leaving investigators with tantalizing but unverifiable information. As 1979 drew to a close, the Thornfield case had generated over 200 pages of reports, interviews, and evidence documentation. Detective Cole had pursued every lead with professional thoroughness, but found himself confronting the reality that some cases resist solution despite the best efforts of dedicated investigators. The physical evidence was suggestive but inconclusive. The witness testimony was limited and sometimes contradictory, and the motive for any foul play remained obscure. Eleanor's strength throughout this period became legendary among those who knew her. She maintained Garrett's routines at home, keeping his coffee mug in its usual place and preparing meals for two out of habit and hope. Her quiet determination inspired others in the community to continue their own efforts to find answers, even as official resources were gradually redirected to more recent cases. The spring of 1980 brought renewed search efforts as snow melted and cemetery grounds became accessible again. Volunteer groups organized systematic searches of areas beyond the cemetery itself, hoping that evidence might have been overlooked in the initial investigation. These efforts, while ultimately unsuccessful in locating Garrett or definitive answers about his fate, demonstrated the lasting impact his disappearance had made on the community. Detective Cole's final report on the case, filed in June of 1980, concluded that Garrett Thornfield had most likely encountered someone involved in the theft of cemetery materials and had become the victim of circumstances that escalated beyond anyone's intentions. However, Cole acknowledged that this conclusion was based more on probability than evidence, and that significant questions about the case remained unanswered. The official decision to suspend active investigation of the case came in August of 1980, nearly a year after Garrett's disappearance. While the case remained technically open, Detective Cole's retirement in 1982 effectively ended any realistic hope of official resolution. Eleanor accepted this reality with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her response throughout the investigation, though friends noticed that something essential had gone out of her spirit. The years that followed brought inevitable changes to all those touched by the mystery. Eleanor eventually returned to work as a seamstress, finding comfort in the precise, methodical nature of her craft. She never remarried, though she formed close friendships with other women who had experienced similar losses. The small house she had shared with Garrett became a gathering place for those who remembered him and continued to believe that someday answers might emerge. Willowbrook Cemetery itself underwent significant changes in the decade following Garrett's disappearance. New security measures were implemented, including improved lighting and more frequent patrols. The guardhouse, where Garrett had spent his final hours, was eventually relocated and modernized, though older employees still remembered the original building with a mixture of sadness and unease. Marcus Harding, deeply affected by losing a colleague under such mysterious circumstances, left cemetery work entirely and opened a small landscaping business. He rarely spoke about the events of October 14th, but those close to him noticed that he seemed to carry a burden of guilt, as if he somehow should have prevented what happened to Garrett. Detective Raymond Cole's retirement in 1982 marked the end of an era in local law enforcement, but he never forgot the Thornfield case. In interviews years later, he would describe it as the most frustrating investigation of his career, not because of any lack of effort, but because the evidence seemed to lead everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The 1980s and 90s brought significant development to the area surrounding Willowbrook Cemetery. New housing subdivisions and commercial buildings changed the character of what had once been a relatively isolated location. These changes brought more traffic and activity to the area, but also meant that the cemetery was no longer the quiet, remote place it had been during Garrett's tenure. Eleanor aged gracefully, maintaining her home and her memories with equal care. She became something of a local historian, collecting stories and photographs related to the cemetery and its role in community life. Visitors often found her willing to share memories of Garrett and the events that had changed so many lives, though she never lost hope that someday she might learn what really happened that October night. The case gained renewed attention in the late 1990s, when a local journalist writing about unsolved crimes included Garrett's disappearance in a series of articles about mysteries that had shaped the community. This coverage brought forward several individuals who claimed to have information about activities at the cemetery during the late 70s, though their accounts were often inconsistent and impossible to verify after so many years. Theodore Walsh, the head groundskeeper who had first reported the missing supplies, worked at Willowbrook until his retirement in 1995. In his final years, he often spoke about the changes he had witnessed during his long career, but he always returned to the mystery of what had happened to the dedicated night watchman who had cared so deeply about protecting the cemetery and those who rested there. As the new millennium approached, Eleanor Thornfield had become something of a symbol of enduring hope and dignity in the face of unresolved loss. Her quiet strength inspired others who faced their own struggles with uncertainty and grief. Though she rarely spoke publicly about her husband's disappearance, those who knew her understood that she had never stopped believing that truth would eventually emerge. The 21st century brought new technologies and investigative techniques that might have provided answers to questions that had puzzled investigators in 1979. DNA analysis, improved forensic methods, and digital databases offered tools that Detective Cole could never have imagined during his original investigation. However, the passage of time had also meant that physical evidence had been lost or degraded, and many of the original witnesses had passed away. Eleanor's death in 2007 marked the end of an era for those who remembered the case. Her funeral at Willowbrook Cemetery was attended by hundreds of community members who'd been touched by her story and her grace. She was buried beside a memorial stone for Garrett, though his body had never been found. The inscription she had chosen read simply, "Together again, forever watching." The case might have faded entirely from public memory if not for the persistence of Detective Sarah Martinez, who joined the Columbus Police Department's cold case unit in 2012. Martinez had grown up hearing stories about the mysterious disappearance at Willowbrook Cemetery and was intrigued by the unresolved questions that had puzzled investigators for more than 30 years. Martinez's fresh examination of the case files revealed several avenues that had never been fully explored, partly due to the technological limitations of the original investigation. Her systematic review of evidence and witness statements identified patterns and connections that had been difficult to recognize using the investigative tools available in 1979. The breakthrough came in October of 2018, almost exactly 39 years after Garrett's disappearance. Construction workers preparing ground for a new memorial garden at Willowbrook Cemetery made a discovery that would finally provide answers to questions that had haunted the community for nearly 4 decades. Buried beneath decades of accumulated soil and vegetation, less than 100 yards from where Garrett's footprints had mysteriously ended, they uncovered a collection of personal items that had clearly been hidden deliberately many years earlier. Among these items was Garrett's missing flashlight, still recognizable despite years of burial, and a small notebook that had somehow survived the elements well enough for forensic experts to recover partial entries. The notebook contained handwritten observations about suspicious activities at the cemetery, including license plate numbers and descriptions of individuals who had been meeting on the grounds during evening hours. Most significantly, the notebook contained entries dated just days before Garrett's disappearance, describing what he believed was a coordinated effort to steal materials not just from the cemetery, but from several construction sites in the area. The missing cemetery supplies, it appeared, had been part of a larger operation that used the remote location as a storage and meeting point for stolen goods. Detective Martinez realized that Garrett Thornfield had stumbled upon something much more significant than petty theft. The evidence suggested he had been documenting a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond Willowbrook Cemetery, and that his dedication to protecting the sacred ground under his care had ultimately led him into a situation far more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. The forensic analysis of Garrett's notebook revealed entries that painted a picture far more complex than anyone had imagined during the original investigation. Detective Martinez worked methodically through the recovered pages, each revelation adding another piece to a puzzle that had remained incomplete for nearly 4 decades. The handwriting, though faded and water-damaged in places, clearly belonged to Garrett, and the dates corresponded to the weeks immediately preceding his disappearance. What emerged from these pages was the portrait of a watchman who had stumbled upon something that went far beyond simple theft from cemetery grounds. Garrett had documented a sophisticated operation that used Willowbrook Cemetery as a central hub for coordinating thefts from construction sites throughout the region. The remote location, with its multiple access points and infrequent nighttime visitors, provided an ideal meeting place for individuals involved in what appeared to be a well-organized criminal enterprise. The notebook entries showed that Garrett had been methodically gathering evidence for weeks, recording license plate numbers, noting meeting times, and even sketching rough maps showing where stolen materials were being temporarily stored on cemetery grounds before being transported elsewhere. His dedication to protecting the sacred space under his care had transformed him from a simple security guard into an inadvertent investigator, documenting crimes that extended far beyond his official responsibilities. Detective Martinez recognized that Garrett's disappearance had not been the result of a chance encounter with petty thieves, but rather the consequence of his growing knowledge about an operation that could not afford to have its activities exposed. The careful documentation in his notebook suggested he had been planning to present his findings to authorities, unaware that his investigation had already been detected by those he was observing. The breakthrough in understanding what had happened that October night came when Martinez cross-referenced the license plate numbers from Garrett's notebook with criminal records from the late 1970s. Several of the vehicles belonged to individuals with extensive histories of involvement in organized theft operations, men who had been suspected but never convicted of coordinating major burglaries throughout the region during that period. Among these names was Vincent Carlucci, a figure who had been peripherally involved in numerous investigations during the late 70s, but had always managed to avoid conviction through a combination of careful planning and strategic silence. Carlucci had died in 1993, but Martinez's investigation revealed that he had been the central figure in a criminal network that specialized in coordinating thefts of construction materials, equipment, and supplies. The connection to Willowbrook Cemetery became clear when Martinez discovered that Carlucci's organization had been using remote locations throughout the region as temporary storage and meeting points. The cemetery's isolation, combined with the predictable schedule of the night watchman, had made it an attractive location for their operations, until Garrett's growing awareness had threatened to expose their activities. Martinez's investigation revealed that on the night of October 14, 1979, Garrett had encountered members of Carlucci's organization during what should have been his routine 11 o'clock patrol. The evidence suggested that this encounter had not been planned, but rather the result of Garrett's decision to investigate the maintenance area more thoroughly than usual, following up on his suspicions about the missing supplies. What happened during that encounter would never be known with complete certainty, but the evidence painted a picture of a dedicated man who had found himself in circumstances far beyond what his experience as a cemetery watchman had prepared him to handle. The location where his footprints ended, near the cemetery's rear wall, showed signs of disturbance that suggested a struggle had occurred, though the physical evidence was too degraded after nearly 4 decades to provide specific details. The most significant revelation came when Martinez's team located Vincent Carlucci's former associates, several of whom were still alive and had been living with the knowledge of what had happened that night for nearly 40 years. The weight of carrying this secret, combined with the passage of time and changes in their own lives, had created a burden that several of these men were finally ready to address. Thomas Brennan, who had been 23 years old in 1979 and deeply involved in Carlucci's organization, agreed to meet with Detective Martinez in the spring of 2019. The man who sat across from her in the interview room bore little resemblance to the young criminal who had been present at Willowbrook Cemetery that October night. Time, family responsibilities, and the weight of unresolved guilt had transformed him into someone seeking redemption for actions he had spent decades trying to forget. Brennan's account of that night revealed the tragic sequence of events that had led to Garrett's disappearance. The operation at the cemetery had been routine, with several men meeting to divide stolen materials and plan future activities. Garrett's earlier patrol had gone unnoticed, but his decision to return to the maintenance area during his 11 o'clock round had surprised the group in the middle of their activities. The confrontation that followed had not been planned or intended by either side. Garrett, according to Brennan's account, had approached the group with the authority of someone responsible for protecting the cemetery grounds, unaware that he was dealing with individuals who could not afford to let their activities be reported to authorities. The criminal organization, surprised by the unexpected encounter, had reacted with a desperation born from knowing that exposure would mean lengthy prison sentences for all involved. What happened next had haunted Brennan for 40 years. The group had not intended violence, but Garrett's determination to report what he had witnessed had created a situation where they felt they had no choice but to prevent him from leaving the cemetery. The struggle that ensued had resulted in Garrett's death, an outcome that none of the participants had wanted, but that seemed inevitable once the confrontation began. Brennan's voice broke as he described the group's panic in the aftermath of Garrett's death. These were criminals who specialized in theft, not violence, and they found themselves facing a situation they were completely unprepared to handle. The decision to conceal what had happened had been made in desperation, with the group removing Garrett's body from the cemetery grounds and disposing of it in a location that would ensure it would never be found. The small items buried near the cemetery wall had been overlooked in their haste to clean up evidence of their presence. Garrett's flashlight and notebook had been dropped during the struggle and forgotten in the chaos that followed. The men involved in the operation had scattered immediately afterward, with most leaving the region permanently within weeks of the incident. Detective Martinez listened to Brennan's account with the professional composure that years of police work had taught her, but internally she was moved by the obvious, genuine remorse that this man carried for his role in events that had occurred when he was barely more than a boy himself. The revelation that Garrett had died accidentally while confronting criminals in the course of doing his job provided answers to questions that had persisted for decades, though those answers brought their own form of pain. The investigation that followed Brennan's confession revealed the broader scope of the criminal operation that had been using Willowbrook Cemetery as a meeting point. Records from the period showed that construction thefts in the region had dropped dramatically after October of 1979, suggesting that Garrett's death had effectively ended the organization's activities in the area. Vincent Carlucci's network had never fully recovered from the disruption caused by the incident at the cemetery. However, the passage of nearly 4 decades meant that legal consequences for those involved would be limited. Carlucci himself had died years earlier, and most of his associates were either deceased or too elderly to face prosecution. Brennan's cooperation with the investigation reflected his genuine desire to finally tell the truth about what had happened, rather than any fear of legal consequences. The revelation of these long-hidden facts created complex emotions for everyone who had been touched by Garrett's disappearance. Detective Martinez found herself in the position of having solved one of the region's most enduring mysteries, but the satisfaction of finding answers was tempered by the knowledge that justice in any traditional sense was no longer possible. The most immediate impact was felt by those who had known Garrett personally and had spent decades wondering about his fate. Marcus Harding, now in his 80s and living in a retirement community, broke down when Martinez called to inform him about the investigation's findings. The guilt he had carried for 40 years, believing he should have somehow prevented what happened to his colleague, could finally be addressed with the knowledge that nothing he could have done would have changed the outcome. Theodore Walsh, the former head groundskeeper who had first reported the missing supplies, had died several years earlier, but his family was contacted about the investigation's conclusions. His son remembered that his father had always blamed himself for not taking the theft reports more seriously, never realizing that Garrett's disappearance was connected to criminal activities far beyond anything Walsh could have imagined. The community response to the revelation was complex and varied. Some residents felt a sense of closure, knowing that the mystery had finally been solved, while others struggled with the knowledge that the dedicated Watchman had died, protecting the cemetery grounds he had cared about so deeply. Local media coverage of the case's resolution sparked conversations about how communities remember those who serve them and the hidden dangers that sometimes accompany even seemingly safe occupations. Willowbrook Cemetery itself underwent another transformation as news of the investigation's findings spread throughout the community. The location where Garrett's personal items had been discovered became an informal memorial site, with visitors leaving flowers and small tokens of remembrance. Cemetery management eventually installed a formal memorial plaque recognizing Garrett's dedication to protecting the sacred ground under his care. The plaque's inscription, chosen after consultation with community members who remembered Garrett, read simply, "In memory of Garrett Thornfield, devoted guardian of this sacred space, whose commitment to duty cost him his life. His vigil continues in the hearts of those who remember." The memorial was placed near the chapel, visible to all who visited the cemetery, but positioned respectfully away from individual grave sites. Detective Martinez's work on the case extended beyond simply solving the mystery of Garrett's disappearance. Her investigation had revealed broader patterns of criminal activity from the late 1970s that helped explain several other unsolved cases from that period. The meticulous documentation in Garrett's notebook provided evidence that assisted in closing multiple cold cases related to construction thefts throughout the region. The detective's final report on the Thornfield case ran to over 300 pages and became a model for how modern investigative techniques could be applied to decades-old crimes. Martinez's systematic approach, combining traditional detective work with advanced forensic analysis, demonstrated how persistence and fresh perspectives could breathe new life into cases that had seemed permanently unsolvable. The case's resolution also had broader implications for cemetery security practices throughout the region. Cemetery administrators and security companies began implementing new protocols designed to better protect both the sacred grounds under their care and the individuals responsible for maintaining them. Garrett's death, while tragic, had contributed to changes that would help prevent similar tragedies in the future. Perhaps the most profound impact of the investigation's conclusion was its effect on how the community remembered Garrett Thornfield himself. No longer was he simply a man who had mysteriously disappeared while working as a night watchman. Instead, he was recognized as someone who had died in the line of duty, protecting the cemetery grounds he had cared about deeply and confronting criminals who threatened the peace of that sacred space. The annual memorial service held at Willowbrook Cemetery each October 14th became a community tradition that attracted participants from throughout the region. These gatherings served not only to remember Garrett specifically, but to honor all those who work to protect and maintain the sacred spaces where communities gather to remember their loved ones. The ceremony invariably concluded with a moment of silence, as participants walked the paths that Garrett had patrolled during his 3 years as the cemetery's guardian. Schools throughout the area began incorporating Garrett's story into their curricula, not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of night work, but as an example of how ordinary people sometimes find themselves in extraordinary circumstances while simply trying to do their jobs well. His dedication to documenting the criminal activity he had observed, even at personal risk, was presented as an example of civic responsibility and professional integrity. The community's relationship with Willowbrook Cemetery itself evolved as the full story of Garrett's disappearance became known. Visitors began to see the peaceful grounds not only as a place of rest for their loved ones, but as a location where someone had made the ultimate sacrifice to protect that peace. The cemetery's reputation grew as news of the case's resolution spread, with people traveling from distant communities to visit the memorial and pay their respects to Garrett's memory. Detective Martinez often reflected on how the case had affected her own understanding of police work and community service. The investigation had taught her that some crimes create ripples that extend far beyond their immediate victims, touching entire communities and persisting across generations until truth finally emerges. The 40-year delay in solving Garrett's case had not diminished its impact, but rather had allowed that impact to deepen and spread as more people learned about the dedicated watchman who had died protecting the cemetery he served. The case files from the Thornfield investigation were eventually donated to a local university's criminal justice program, where they became part of a collection used to teach students about cold case investigation techniques. Martinez regularly lectured to classes about the importance of persistence in police work and the ways that advancing technology could breathe new life into old investigations. Garrett's story became part of the education of future detectives who would face their own seemingly unsolvable cases. As the community marked the 40th anniversary of Garrett's disappearance in October of 2019, the memorial service took on special significance. The revelation of what had actually happened that night had transformed the annual gathering from a remembrance of an unsolved mystery into a celebration of a man who had died serving his community. The change in tone was subtle but profound, reflecting how truth had the power to transform grief into honor. The cemetery itself had changed dramatically since 1979, with improved lighting, enhanced security systems, and more frequent patrols. But visitors often commented that the essential character of the place remained unchanged. The ancient trees still provided natural canopies over winding paths, flowers still bloomed throughout the changing seasons, and the peaceful atmosphere that had drawn Garrett to the work of cemetery security continued to offer comfort to those who came to remember their loved ones. Detective Martinez's career was profoundly shaped by her work on the Thornfield case. The investigation's success led to her appointment as head of the cold case unit, where she applied the same methodical approach to other unsolved crimes. She often told colleagues that Garrett Thornfield had taught her that no case was truly unsolvable, only temporarily beyond the reach of available technology and investigative techniques. In her final years before retirement, Martinez established a scholarship program for students studying criminal justice, funded partially through speaking fees from her lectures about the Thornfield case. The scholarship honored both Garrett's memory and the principle that truth, while sometimes delayed, ultimately emerges when dedicated people refuse to abandon the search for answers. The children and grandchildren of those who had known Garrett personally grew up hearing stories about the dedicated night watchman who had cared so deeply about protecting Willowbrook Cemetery. These stories became part of the community's oral history, passed down through generations and ensuring that Garrett's memory would persist long after all those who had known him personally were gone. Thomas Brennan, the former criminal who had finally revealed the truth about what happened that October night, spent his remaining years involved in community service programs designed to help young people avoid the paths that had led him into criminal activity. His cooperation with the investigation had provided the closure that so many had sought for decades, and his subsequent commitment to positive community involvement represented a form of redemption that honored Garrett's memory in its own way. The Willowbrook Cemetery Memorial Plaque became a destination for those studying unsolved crimes and their eventual resolution. The inscription's simple words carried profound meaning for visitors who understood the full story of Garrett's dedication and sacrifice. Many left flowers or small stones as tokens of respect, following traditions that connected them to centuries of human practices for honoring those who had died in service to others. On quiet nights, when mist formed among the cemetery's ancient trees and security lights cast long shadows between weathered headstones, those walking the paths that Garrett had once patrolled could almost sense his continuing presence. The peace he had died protecting remained intact, watched over by new generations of security personnel who understood the dedication required to maintain sacred space where communities gathered to remember their loved ones. The story of Garrett Thornfield ultimately became more than the account of one man's disappearance and the decades-long search for answers. It evolved into a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of truth, and the ways that ordinary people sometimes become heroes simply by refusing to abandon their responsibilities when faced with extraordinary circumstances. His legacy lived on in the peaceful cemetery grounds he had protected, in the community that had never forgotten him, and in the knowledge that dedication to duty, while sometimes costly, creates ripples of positive influence that extend far beyond what any individual could imagine. In the end, Garrett Thornfield had achieved the immortality that comes to those who serve something greater than themselves. His vigil over Willowbrook Cemetery had ended that October night in 1979, but his watch continued in the hearts and memories of all those who had learned from his example. The mystery of his disappearance had finally been solved, but the mystery of how one person's commitment to duty could inspire so many others would continue indefinitely, passed down through generations who would never know his name but would benefit from the standard of service he had established through his life and death.